I'm from this area, so this is home for me, y'all. I'm from Fort Worth. So the first service, I know I played basketball against some of y'all when I was at OD Wide High School, so don't hold any grudges, no bad memories, whatever. But so excited to be here and honored to be with y'all today. The story that we're going to share with you today is in a book that we've written called The Dream King, how the dream of Martin Luther King is being fulfilled to heal racism in America. How many of you know God's using the United Church to heal a divided nation? And this is not just our story. This is all of our story. This is what we're walking in right now. And so just to get started, I want to play just a little bit of a video clip. You're probably wondering what this thing is. We'll get to that in just a second. Let's go ahead and play that clip for everybody real quick.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
It's a powerful, powerful speech, right? I love that speech. Love the whole thing. But one of the reasons why I love it so much is because I'm one of those sons of former slaves. And this kettle pot that you see here was used by the slaves in my family. It's been passed down from generation to generation. It was used by the slaves in my family. They used it for cooking. They used it for washing clothes. But secretly, they used it for prayer. Now, honestly, I hadn't thought much about it. So I went to a little conference. It was in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Man, Dutch Sheets was giving a teaching on prayer. And he was talking about the power of agreement in prayer. And talked about this concept called synergy. Synergy is when you take two separate things and when you connect them together, it doesn't create an addition of power, but a multiplicity of power, right? Scientists say if you take two horses and if you put them together, if they're pulling the same load, it's as if a third invisible horse has been added. Spiritually, we know that what? One could put 1,000 to flight and two could put what? 10,000 to flight. That's synergy. So thinking about it, we start getting all this agreement in prayer between red, yellow, black, and white. We start getting agreement in prayer between old, young, male, and female. We can see the synergistic exponential release in the power of prayer like we've never seen before, right? But then Dutch says something that was so profound while he was talking. He said this: not only can you agree in prayer with the person sitting next to you, you can also agree in prayer with the generation behind you. He talked about how he's at his alma mater, Christ for the Nations Institute, where I work today. But back then, he was there at the school. He was leading the student body in a time of praying for revival to hit the school. And while he's praying, he heard the Holy Spirit say to him, Dutch, I want you to come in agreement with the prayers of the founder of the school. He thought, okay, Holy Spirit, is this really you? Because that man's dead. He's been dead for 30 or 40 years, and I know you're not talking to the dead. And he heard the Lord say to him, I didn't say agree with him. I said agree with his prayers. His prayers are still alive before my throne. There are things I want to do with those prayers. I need a generation to agree with them because the things I want to do in this generation that I started back in that generation, I want to bring about the synergy of the ages. So finally that scripture, Hebrews 11:39 and 40, finally made sense to me where it says, all these by faith, talking about the great heroes of faith. They were approved for their faith, but they did not receive what was promised. So that apart from us, they would be made perfect without us. In other words, there's this whole company of people, y'all, looking over the balcony of heaven. My grandmother, your grandmother, grandfather, looking over the balcony of heaven, all those believers, saying, hey, y'all, don't mess this thing up because God started something in us that he wants to complete exponentially through you. Right? Jesus said it best when he said, what greater works than these are you going to do because I'm going to the Father. So he'll start something in one generation, complete it exponentially through future generations, especially in the place of prayer. When he said that, I was a wreck because I remember this part of my family. Like I said, it was used by the slaves in my family. They used it for cooking. They used it for washing clothes. But secretly, it was used for prayer. They were owned by a slave master in Lake Providence, Louisiana, who would beat them for any reason, and praying was one of them. See, back then, they wanted slaves to be Christians because they knew that Christian slaves made better workers. But they would pervert the gospel back then and say, slaves, be obedient to your masters if you want to go to heaven. Now, we know we're saved by grace through faith, not of works. It's a gift of God so that no one should boast. But it was easy to teach slaves that back then because it was against the law for slaves to read and write. It was also against the law for anybody to teach them how to read and write. So while they wanted them to be Christians, the irony is that they didn't want them to pray because they felt like if they prayed, it would foster hope. They thought if they got hopeful, they would try to run away. So they would literally be beaten on that plantation if they were caught praying. Give an example how cruel slavery was back then, with a story passed down in our family about a great uncle who was literally beat to death just for going fishing without asking while he was on this plantation. So that's how cruel slavery was back then. But listen, these folks were Christians, they were believers, and they decided to pray anyway. So what they would do is they would have a prayer meeting in the middle of the night so that their prayer meeting wouldn't be seen, but to make sure it wasn't heard, they used this pot as an acoustic means to muffle their voices. How did they do that? Well, they would take this pot, turn it upside down on the cabin floor. Then they'd take 3 or 4 rocks and prop up the edges of the kettle so it'd be suspended off the ground about 1 inch or 2. They would then lay prostrate on the ground and put their lips in between the opening between the ground and the kettle so that the kettle pot muffled their voices as they prayed through the night. And the story they passed down with this pot is this, is that they didn't think they would see freedom in their time. So they prayed for the freedom of their children and the next generation. So one day freedom comes as this young teenage girl. She decides to keep this pot and that story in our family. Now, why would she do that? She's probably thinking about all those who are dead and gone, who risked their lives to pray for her. She's probably thinking about all those who are too old to enjoy the freedom she's about to embrace. So she keeps this pot and this story in our family, and she passed the pot and the story down to Harriet Lockett. Harriet Lockett passed it on to her daughter, Nora Lockett. Nora Lockett passed it on to her son, William Ford Sr., who then passed it on to William Ford Jr., who then gave it to me, William Ford III. So I'm there at this conference, and I'm thinking about the heart that God had given me for revival in our nation. And I'm thinking about how it was the prayers of that godly remnant, not just black Christian slaves, but white Christian abolitionists that prayed into being the first and the second great awakening. Had it not been for those revivals, slavery wouldn't have ended. I'm thinking about that, but then I also am thinking about my forefathers who prayed for my freedom. And I thought, oh my God, to whom much is given, much is required. But then the thought also hit me, this one amazing privilege that I had now. Oh my God, I get to agree with the prayers of my forefathers for the freedom of this next generation. And I thought about the exponential results that could be released and created from that. I was talking with Pastor Dutch about this. We were talking about doing a prayer journey to take this pot around the country and use it as a focal point for prayer to represent the prayer bowls in heaven. Revelation 5:8 said there are bowls in heaven full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Every time you pray, it goes into a golden bowl, not a plastic bowl or a Tupperware bowl, not a wooden bowl, a golden bowl, because that's how precious your prayers are to God. Listen, there's a prayer bowl over Burleson. There's a prayer bowl over Dallas and Fort Worth. There's a prayer bowl over our nation. God's looking for a new generation to resource the prayer bowls once again. That said, God, do you really want me to have some cast iron cooking pot represent the prayer bowls in heaven? That said, about that time, his Bible falls open to Zechariah 14:20. Part B of that verse says this, and the cooking pots in the house of the Lord shall be like the bowls before the altar. So here's this cooking pot that's caught up with prayers, the same as a bowl in heaven that catches our prayers like incense. Dutch said this to me. He said, William, wouldn't it be just like God in his justice and irony that he used the prayers of a slave generation to free a nation up for revival again? So I'm glad he said generation, because it wasn't just black Christian slaves praying back then. There were white Christian abolitionists who knew that if any person was a slave, was a Christian, they knew that person was their brother. Those white abolitionists laid their lives down for their black Christian brothers. Many of them had their houses burned. They were shot, killed, lynched, tarred, and feathered because they chose to suffer with the people of God rather than compromise and wicked slavery. So God began to speak to me about how we wanted to raise up this new remnant. So I learned something from these folks. See, if my ancestors have been Muslims or Buddhists, I have no connection to this part of its history. But because they were Christians, listen, none of these, my ancestors and forefathers, are yours too. Yeah, in other words, I'm just as much a spiritual son of Charles Finney and Jonathan Edwards as you are of Martin Luther King and William Seymour and C.H. Mason. And when we come together in that kind of unity, that kind of agreement, something powerful happens because we're connected because of the blood of Christ. So the Lord dealt with me, honestly, about my own issues. And he said, William, you need to get rid of your own baggage so that you can get to a new vehicle that can bring revival and justice for everybody. And he did that to me, showed me this through this dream that he gave me about the dream of Martin Luther King. In the dream, I'm on my way to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. King's old church, And of course, it's a dream. So in the dream, I couldn't get to his church when I first picked up Dr. King. So we go by this house in the dream. And it's a dream, so Dr. King is alive. So he comes out of this house, but he has this huge white duffel bag with black handles on it. And in the dream, he starts emptying all this dark garbage out of that duffel bag, and he throws the bag down violently, and he comes to get into this vehicle with us. And in the dream, I thought to myself, man, that bag would make a nice souvenir. It shows you how carnal I am, right? Even in my dreams. I'm thinking, I went to Morehouse College, he went to Morehouse College, the bag would make a nice souvenir. But in the dream, before I could even touch the baggage, Dr. King grabbed him over my shoulders in the dream, and he says, no, do not go back and pick that up. And in the dream, he starts telling me what I need to do to heal the race issue in this nation. I wake up from the dream, I was weeping and sobbing the whole night. My pillow was soaked in tears. I didn't even realize I'd been praying the whole night. Shared the dream with my friend, Lou Engle. He begins to weep. We began to ask God for the interpretation. God, remind me, what did Dr. King say to me? And the Lord said this, William, the white bag with the black handles, that will be the interpretation for your dream. And I realized the white bag with the black handles represented how I, as a black man, have been handling my white baggage. God was saying to me, William, get rid of your white baggage. You've been carrying it for way too long. I know what he's putting his finger on because I know what it's like at 13 years old to be chased by a carload full of white guys and called the N-word and say they were going to shoot and kill me. I know what it's like when I was 19 years old to be falsely accused of shoplifting, and when the officer couldn't find anything, he tried to provoke me into a fight. I know what it's like in my 30s to get my first house in a nice suburban area, and then the same police officer for the first 3 months every week would just pull me over for driving while black. I know what that feels like. But you know what I had done? For every white person and every police officer, I put those 3 stories on everybody before I had one conversation with them. It's the devil's diabolical plot. See, it's Revelation 12 where it says that the devil is the accuser of the brethren. The word accuser is a powerful word. In the Greek, it's the word kategoros. It's where we get the word category. So the diabolical plot of the enemy is to get us to categorize and stereotype each other, so that before we can ever have one conversation with each other, we put some bad narrative, some bad story that we've experienced or somebody else experienced on everybody else. God was saying to me, William, get rid of your unforgiveness. Get rid of your bitterness. Get rid of your resentment. Get rid of any guilt manipulation. Get rid of your white baggage so you can get in a new vehicle that can bring revival and justice for everybody. So the question God has for all of us right now is this: what color is your baggage? Get rid of it, because we need each other. Listen, because only a united church is going to heal a divided nation. So I had this book with me that had all these speeches of Dr. King, and it falls open to the I Have a Dream speech. And Matt, if you go ahead and come up, I get to this part where it says, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves were going to sit together at the table of brotherhood. And I thought, whatever happened to that family that owned us? So there was this prayer meeting that my friend was going to have at the Lincoln Memorial. It was Martin Luther King Celebration Day, and that's where Matt Lockett and I meet. Matt, please come up and share.
Good morning. So I'm going to start right where Will just left off and just kind of kick in right there and tell you how my story connects with Will's story. It was January 17th, 2005, was that prayer gathering on the Lincoln Memorial that he was talking about. But I'm going to back up 1 year exactly to the day. It was January 17th the previous year that something really tragic happened when my dad passed away unexpectedly. And so when you go through something like that, something big happens in your life. You have spent your entire life being the recipient of the stories, right? You've been receiving from mom and dad, but when you lose them, you now become the steward of the storyline. And a mantle gets placed on you, and you have to actually decide in those moments, going forward, what is the story that I'm going to tell? Is it going to be the stories of all the pain and the brokenness of the past? Or has God started something in your yesterday that he wants to propel into the future? And so it was during that time that, I was asking, the big questions that need big answers, like, who am I? Why am I here? Listen, it doesn't matter if you're 16 or 60. Your Heavenly Father loves for you to ask that question. He wants to tell you who you are and why he put you here and why he gave you the life that he gave you. Amen? And so I was asking those questions, and one of the things that became really important to me at that time was I wanted to find out, where did my family come from? What was the history of the Lockett family? And that was really hard because even though my dad was one of 16 siblings, come on, mamma, Yeah. 16 siblings. They couldn't get beyond my dad's grandfather because there had been a loss of the records, but really, they just, somewhere along the way, somebody stopped telling the stories. Now, how many of you have looked into your family trees? Okay, there's a few hands that have gone up, but not many. I've noticed as I've been asking this question, excuse me, fewer and fewer hands have been going up when I ask that question. That tells me that we're losing stories right now. We are losing the stories of potentially what God had already begun in our yesterday. And I think we're in a moment right now of discovery that God wants us to find out what he's been working on. So I spent that year trying to figure out where my family came from, and I actually hit all the same roadblocks that everybody in the family had hit, and I didn't find anything out. It was exactly where it all, I ended where it all started. And it was during that time that I was so frustrated that I had a dream. Now, we're talking about dreams this morning. Do we have any dreamers in this church? Oh, I rang somebody's bell there. All right, so I'm talking about the kind of dreams where you go to sleep at night and you feel like the God of the universe is talking to you personally and pizza doesn't get the credit. All right, those kinds of dreams. So it was during that time I had a dream, and God began to speak to me in a very unusual way about how he was going to shift the culture in this nation to end injustice and how he was going to do that through day and night prayer. Now, I didn't know what to do with that. That dream came from somewhere else, but I met a man in my dream named Lou Engle, and I didn't know Lou Engle. So in the days after that, I started looking. I found out there was a real guy named Lou Engle. He was really doing this thing with prayer, and I tried to reach out to him. I ended up getting somebody that he worked with on the phone, said, I don't know you and you don't know me, but I had a dream, and he totally took me seriously on the phone. It wasn't a sales call. He took me seriously. I told him the dream. He said, this is very interesting. You've just dreamt exactly what the Lord is sending us and our team to do. We're going to Washington, D.C. to pray, just like you saw in the dream. But we're going to do a special gathering on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Martin Luther King Day. Maybe you should come to it. God might have something for you there. Now, come on. I lived in Colorado at the time. God, do you really want me to take time off work, spend hard-earned money to go to a prayer meeting on the other side of the country? Like, I can do this at my own church. God, what are you doing? Now, do you guys play the confirmation game? You know what I'm talking about? Like, where you're like, if you want me to do this, then you create this, like, ridiculously difficult scenario, right? And you're like, if you can do this, then I'll know that it's you talking to me. And you're not supposed to test God, but God's like, yeah, I'll do it anyway. And he does it. And then you're like, okay, if I don't do this, now I'm in disobedience, right? So I did that. God confirmed it. So I go to this prayer meeting. I actually have a photo. I want to show it to you. If you could put up the first image. This is a picture of that prayer meeting. You can see the Lincoln Memorial in the background. It's not a very large gathering. Lou Engle's in there on the right side if you know who he is. But if you follow that blue arm on the left side all the way out to the fingertips, you'll see right at the end, that's Will Ford. So right there on that day, that was the first time Will Ford and I ever came together on the spot where Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech. And so that night, there was a guest speaker, and it was Will Ford, and he brought out this kettle, and he told the story that you've just heard this morning. Now, it had been 1 year to the day since my dad died. I was a mess. I didn't know anything about my history, and yet I'm listening to this man talk about this rich spiritual heritage. Right? His family who had contended for the destiny of America. And I'm listening, and I didn't know what to do with it, but then he shared that detail that this locket was given to Harriet Lockett, or this kettle was given to Harriet Lockett, who gave it to Nora Lockett, to Will Ford Sr., to Will Ford Jr., to Will Ford III, the man on the stage. And I was in this like Moses moment where you hear your name being called, because my last name is Lockett. So I went up to him afterwards. We met for the first time and began to compare notes, and he asked how our Lockett spelled it with one T or two. We spelled it with two. His spelled it with one. He asked where our Locketts were from. We didn't really know, so the best we knew is Kentucky. His Locketts were from Louisiana. So it was this amazing coincidence. But it was enough that we struck up a friendship that very night. We prayed together, and from that moment, we began to build a relationship, and for years, we just began to run together do ministry together, pray together, and do life together. Try to love each other well. And I kind of think that's how this is supposed to work. Now, fast forward. Lou Engle was going to do one of those prayer gatherings in Washington, or in the state of Virginia. And God had spoken to our house of prayer in D.C. through events from the Civil War. And he spoke specifically about the end of the Civil War, which happened at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. Now, if you don't know your American history, General Lee is in retreat. Grant is chasing him. They get to a place called Sailor's Creek. He fights his last battle. And then on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant. There's your American History 101. If you slept through that class like I did, now we're all square. All right. So Lou was going to do one of those prayer meetings in Virginia. He said, if we're going to do this, first we have to go pray there. So we went to Appomattox and we prayed. We prayed for the nation there in that place. And we stepped into the little visitors center. And Lou and I were standing side by side. And he grabs the first book off the shelf that caught his eye. It was this book right here. And he opens it to the first random page. What is it about God where he likes to make books fall open to pages? I don't know this. He just likes it, I guess. So I have another picture if you want to put that second image up. This is the page he turned to. It's called The Last Shot, the Battle of Lockett's Farm, spelled with 2 T's. And I didn't know what this was, but I'm thinking this seems significant. I'm in another Moses moment. I'm hearing my name called. And so I began to look this up. What I found out is that the last battle that Lee fought was in the front yard of a family named Lockett. This was the last battle of the Civil War. And so it was right about that time that my older brother actually got breakthrough on our family genealogy. He got us all the way back to 1645. And he said, we came in as settlers through Virginia. And I said, well, let me tell you something about Virginia. And I started to tell him this story about Lockett's Farm. And he stops me and he says, that's not that place by Sailor's Creek, is it? I said, that is exactly where it is. Why? He said, oh, I just found the documents. That was our family. So after years of praying into the dreams from God, I find out that the last battle of the Civil War happened in my family's front yard. And now, think about this. Here's Will. He has this kettle, which represents the prayers that the slaves prayed for the ending of slavery. And now I find out that my family has this homestead where the last battle defending slavery was fought. That's where the war essentially ended. And I'm thinking, this seems significant. So I go there. If you want to put up that next image, this is a picture of Lockett's farm. It's been preserved from the day of battle. It still has bullet holes in it. And there's the historical marker in the front yard. Here Lee fought his last battle. I went there and I went in. The man who lives there invited me into the house, and I was stunned when framed and hanging on the wall was the Lockett genealogy. And I get out my brother's research. It's my family. And then he said this. He says, some of the Locketts left here and went to the Deep South. And then he said, some of them went to Louisiana. And some of them, there was an error in those handwritten census ledgers, and they dropped one of the T's and changed the spelling of the name. Now, Will, why don't you share what we discovered once we heard
Matt
this?
flies from D.C. to Dallas, lays out all this information, and we started comparing notes and talking and praying and crying, honestly. Because my oldest known family member was a man named Isaac Lockett. He shows up in the 1870 census. He's 90 years old. He's living in Lake Providence, Louisiana. So 5 years after slavery, that's probably the place where he was a slave. But in that document, Isaac Lockett said he was originally from Virginia. Probably willed off to another family member or a friend. That's how they would do slaves. And also, slaves would talk on the last names. They would take on the last names of the people who owned them. So we did more research, looking at how Matt's family was one of the few Locketts that was in that area at that time period. After a year and a half of research, here's what we learned, y'all. We learned that it was Matt's family who owned my family, where the kettle pot came from. So think about it. Here's my family praying for the ending of slavery there in Lake Providence. And then all the way up at the farmhouse of the people who originally owned them, slavery comes to end in their front yard. But then, because he's the God of the past and the future, and he loves to heal history, he takes 2 family members from those same families, Matt and I, and he weaves our storylines together so we can war against injustice in our day and cry for awakening in our time.
Amen. So you have to understand that it wasn't the story that connected Will and I. If we had learned this story at the beginning, I think we would have exploded. Or worse, we would have perverted the story. We didn't learn this story until about 10 years later, after we had been praying together and learning how to love one another. And so imagine how I felt when I discovered that my connection to this story I've been hearing all these years was to that of the slave owner. That was painful. I want you to hear me on that. It was painful to learn that, because now this wasn't just a story that you read about in a book. This was real, and it had a face and a name, and it was a face that I loved. So God made this very personal for me. But now, here's the thing. We've all got bad stuff in our past and in our family lines, but I believe God has started something in our past that he wants us to step into and walk in now in this generation. And so what I found is that when you go back a little bit further, revival had come to Virginia. And in the previous generation, one of my ancestors named Daniel Lockett, he became a Methodist circuit rider. And what's interesting about that, what you have to know about those guys, is that they were revivalists and they were abolitionists. So God had already started something in my family. And so I can look at it and say, yeah, we had slaves. Or I can say, no, God actually started a legacy of revival and abolition. And I've locked in on that to release that in this generation.
So in all of our families, we have these things called generational curses and generational blessings that represent these dominating themes or storylines. So what God is shouting to America right now is this: what storyline do we want to be a part of? The healing or the hurt, the blessing or the curse? What storyline do we want to be a part of? Last story, and share this.
Last story, just so you can get a good example of what will means. So after the Civil War, he mentioned that it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write. But guess what? After the war, still wasn't very popular. And so they would do it in secret. And in one night, walks Lucy Lockett, and she catches a former slave trying to teach her young son how to read and write. Only instead of consequences, I have to look at it this way, Lucy chose a different storyline. She looks at the mother and says, no, what you've chosen to do is very wise. And she begins taking up tutoring this young boy in how to read and write. And we know that story because that little boy grew up to be Robert Russell Moton. If you want to put up the last image, he was a president of Tuskegee Institute, replacing Booker T. Washington. And in 1922, he gave the dedication speech of the Lincoln Memorial, where 41 years later, Dr. King would stand on that spot and declare, I have a dream. And 41 years after that moment, Will and I would meet for the first time.
Yeah. So think about it. This happened to two guys who were led by dreams to the place where Dr. King said in his I have a dream speech, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood. So maybe the dream king, maybe the dream speech wasn't poetry, maybe it was prophecy. Maybe there's a dream king called the King of Kings, whose Father still answering his prayer. Father, I pray that there will be one so that your glory can come, so that the world will believe. The same God who broke the power of Dred Scott, he can break the power of Roe v. Wade. He can put an end to systemic poverty. He can shut down our schools. We're in a pipeline of prison. He can end human trafficking and sex slavery. He's just looking for a new generation of people who will drop their agendas and come together and believe.